she didn't cry when he said it. That was the thing nobody could understand. A woman in her 70s, hands raw from cooking oil and cold rope, cartons of homemade chips stacked around her feet, and when the man in the expensive suit leaned out of the doorway and called her a smelly old hag in front of every person in that yard, she just lowered her eyes. Quietly. Like she'd heard worse. Like she expected it. And maybe that was the most heartbreaking part, not the words, not even the cruelty, but the fact that she didn't flinch. Because somewhere behind her, hidden in the shadow of 5 parked motorcycles, a large man in a black leather vest slowly reached up and removed his sunglasses. His name was Jace Carter. And that woman they just humiliated was his mother. Nobody in that yard knew he was there. Nobody had noticed the Iron Saints Road captain leaning against his bike in the far corner of the lot, arms folded, watching. The workers hadn't looked up. The security guards had kept their eyes on the ground. And Rose James, 71 years old, 5'3", smelling like a kitchen that had been running since 3:30 that morning, had not turned around to check if her son was still watching. She already knew he was. She'd told him to wait. Jace took one step forward. His brothers shifted behind him like a tide. But Rose turned her head just slightly and shook it. Not yet. And Jace stopped. Because whatever was happening here, his mother needed it to happen on her terms. Not his. He just didn't understand yet what those terms were, or why she kept coming back to a place that treated her like she didn't belong. That question had been living in his chest for 3 weeks. Rose James had spent her whole life in the kind of quiet that most people mistake for weakness. When her husband Ray passed from a heart attack at 54, she did what she always did. She got up. She cooked. She kept going. The chips were her idea, thin-cut sweet potato and regular potato, seasoned with a blend she'd been refining for decades, packaged in small wax bags tucked into discarded biscuit cartons she collected from bakeries and restaurant suppliers. She sold them at church sales, to neighbors, to anyone who'd take them. And quietly, very quietly, she gave half of them away. Jace hadn't understood the full scope of that until 3 weeks ago, when he'd driven down from Knoxville to help her load the van and noticed she wasn't heading toward the farmer's market. She'd turned left. He followed at a distance and watched her deliver chips to a woman on Caldwell Street with 3 kids and no car. To a veteran named Harold living alone with a leaking roof. To a family 4 months into a highway motel after losing their apartment. She hadn't asked for anything. She'd smiled. She'd left. And then she'd driven straight to the distribution yard of Meridian Foods, where the man in the suit had first told her to get lost. Jace had been parked across the street that day. His mother had asked him not to go in. But it hadn't sat right, and now 3 weeks later he was back, not across the street this time. He was in the yard. The name on the glass door read Damian Cross, Chief Executive Officer. Gold lettering. Of course. Damian was 44, with a watch that cost more than Jace's truck and a smile that never reached his eyes. He pulled up in a black sedan and the whole yard shifted, workers straightened, conversations died. When he spotted Rose kneeling on the concrete organizing her cartons, he didn't hesitate. "You're back." Not a question. A verdict. Rose looked up. "Good morning, Mr. Cross. I told you last time, this is private property." He crossed his arms, scanning the workers like he was performing for them. "People like you never learn, do they?" One worker with a red cap turned away. A woman near the loading door bit her lip. "I'm not causing trouble," Rose said. "I'm just collecting the cartons. They'd go in the trash otherwise. I don't care what happens to them." No heat in his voice, just flat, clean dismissal. "I care about not having someone who smells like a fryer sitting in my yard scaring off my delivery contacts. Get her out. If I see her back again, whoever let her in loses their job." The cartons toppled. Rose's hands had shaken just enough. She bent slowly to pick them up, and not one person in that yard moved to help her. They stood frozen in that particular shame that comes from watching something cruel and doing nothing. Jace was already moving. His boots hit the concrete like a door slamming in an empty church. His 5 brothers fell in behind him, unhurried, unbothered. Damien cross-turned. And for just a flicker, something crossed his face that wasn't confidence. Rose stood. Turned. Looked directly at her son. "Jace." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Please." He stopped 6 feet from Damien. Close enough to make a point. Far enough to keep his word. "We're not here for trouble," he said, "not an apology, a fact." Then he crouched down and picked up the fallen cartons, one by one, without breaking eye contact with Damien. He handed them to his mother, straightened up, and said, "Let's go, Mom." They walked out. Jace's jaw was tight the whole drive home. Rose sat with her hands folded in her lap and neither of them spoke until finally he said, "Why do you keep going back there?" She looked out the window at the Tennessee hills rolling past. "Because something there belongs to me," she said. "Not the cartons. Something else." "What?" She shook her head. "You'll understand soon enough. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos." The morning after, Jace started making calls. His mother had said something belonged to her at Meridian Foods, and Rose James did not speak imprecisely. He reached out to a brother named Walt who'd grown up on that side of town. Walt pointed him to an old mechanic named Terry, 30 years on the Meridian loading docks before his knees gave out. It took 2 days to find him. Terry was in a double-wide off Route 9, football on too loud, and when Jace knocked and said his mother's name the old man went still. Then he opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. I wondered when someone would ask. What Terry told him that night changed everything. Meridian Foods had not always been Meridian Foods. 30 years ago it was Hale Regional Packaging, owned by Robert Cross, Damien's father. Robert started with a warehouse, 2 forklifts, and borrowed credit. In the early years the business nearly died 3 times, supply shortages, a fire, a contract dispute that wiped out the operating capital. There were moments it should have folded. It didn't. And Terry explained why. There was a woman on the morning processing line, he said. In every day at 4 a.m. quiet. Good worker. When Robert got sick, bad pneumonia, and the business was about to miss payroll, she went to him privately. Said she'd work 8 weeks without pay if he promised to keep the other workers on. She also negotiated a supplier deal that saved the company around $40,000 in waste costs. Did it herself. Didn't tell Robert until it was done. He paused. Her name was Rose. Jace sat very still. Robert always said she was the reason the place survived, Terry continued. He kept records of everything. Intended to repay her formally when the business stabilized. Then he got sick again, worse, and died before he could. His son inherited everything. Terry looked at him steadily. And his son never looked at those records. Jace drove home slowly. He sat in the truck in the driveway a long time before going in. His mother was at the stove and didn't turn around. "You talked to Terry," she said. "Not a question." "Why didn't you tell me?" She set down the spoon. Turned. "Because I didn't help Robert to be repaid. I helped him because I wanted to." She looked at her son with that steady, patient gaze he'd known his whole life. "But those records exist. They're in the archive room, 3rd floor. Robert told me himself, if anything ever happened to him, I should get them before anyone else. I've been trying to get up there for 2 years without making a scene." She almost smiled. "I'm not as fast as I used to be." Think about what this woman just said. She worked 8 weeks without a single paycheck so other people could keep theirs. She saved a company that wasn't hers. She asked for nothing. And 2 years later she was still being called a smelly old hag in the yard of that same building. Ask yourself, if that were your mother, how long would you have waited? Now, if you've ever watched someone use power to humiliate a person who couldn't fight back, hit that subscribe button and like this video. Because bullies only stay comfortable when they think nobody's watching. And right now, we're all watching. Jace went back to the yard the next morning, alone. He found 4 workers on a smoke break behind the loading dock. The man with the red cap was named Danny. "She started coming around 2 years ago," Danny said. "First time I thought she was just someone off the street. Then she handed me a bag of chips." He looked down. "My wife had just lost her job. 3 kids at home. Rose didn't know any of that. She just handed it over like it was nothing and left." He shook his head. "I found out later she'd been feeding half the families in this neighborhood. Never once said a word about it." The woman from the loading door, Carla, nodded beside him. "She remembered my daughter's name every single time. Never forgot anything about any of us. Never asked for a thing back." An older worker named Pete stared at the ground. "I should have picked up those cartons yesterday," he said quietly. "I'm ashamed I didn't." Jace looked at each of them. "She needs to get into the 3rd floor archive room," he said. "Today." Without Damien Cross knowing. They looked at each other. Danny nodded. "We can manage that." The next morning Rose arrived as she always did, before the office staff, cartons in hand. Danny was waiting. He walked her through the side entrance and up the stairwell. Pete redirected anyone near the elevator, and Carla held the main door. 11 minutes. Rose walked into the archive room and walked out with a folder pressed flat against her chest, thick as a paperback novel, and crossed the yard like she was just collecting cardboard. Jace was at the lot. "Got them?" She held up the folder. "Now what?" She looked at the gold lettering on the glass door. "Now we let him read them." Jace had made one call the night before. Not to a lawyer, though that would come. He'd called every Iron Saint's brother within 2 hours of the city and said 2 words, "morning shift." By 8 a.m., 43 motorcycles lined the street outside Meridian Foods. No engines. No noise. Just 43 men in leather vests standing on the sidewalk, arms folded, watching the building. Workers arriving for their shifts slowed. Some stopped entirely. Then the former employees came. Terry had made calls of his own, retirees from the Hale regional days, people who remembered Robert Cross, people who remembered Rose. They came in ones and twos, some with canes, some with grandchildren, and stood alongside the Iron Saints without anyone telling them where to go. It happened the way it always happens when people already know which side they're on. And then the families came. The woman from Caldwell Street with her 3 kids. Harold the veteran, moving slowly. The family from the Highway Motel, the mother still holding a wax bag of chips she hadn't been able to throw away. One by one they came and stood, and the silence on that street was the loudest thing it had heard in years. Damien Cross pulled up at 8:40. Stepped out. Stopped. He looked at the motorcycles, the retirees, the families, the workers, and then at Jace Carter standing at the entrance beside a small woman holding a manila folder. His face moved through 3 expressions before settling on something that wanted to look composed. He walked over. "What is this?" Jace didn't answer. Rose stepped forward and held out the folder. "Your father kept very careful records," she said. Damien took it. Opened it. Read. The first page, the second, and then a handwritten note in his father's hand on the 3rd page that made him stop completely. He stood in the parking lot in his expensive suit and read his father's words about a woman who had worked without pay so others could keep their jobs. Who had saved a company she didn't own. Who had asked for nothing and received exactly that. His face went pale. He turned and looked at Rose James standing in the morning light, smelling like cooking oil and cold air, watching him without anger. Without bitterness. Just that clear, patient steadiness that had survived decades of being overlooked. When Damien finally spoke, his voice had lost its shape. "I didn't know," he said. It wasn't an excuse. It was just the truth. "No," Rose said simply. "You didn't." There was no dramatic confrontation after that. No ultimatums. They hadn't come for a performance, they'd come because something needed to be witnessed. Damien stood in that parking lot a long time, then went inside and didn't come back out. 2 weeks later a letter arrived at Rose's home, a formal acknowledgement of everything in the archive, Robert's handwritten accounting of what she'd done and what he'd intended to repay, notarized by Damien. He didn't have to do that. He also quietly established a community food partnership through the company, reaching out to the families Rose had been supplying for years. The food kept showing up. He never came to the yard unannounced again. Rose kept making chips. Kept waking at 3:30. Kept delivering. She didn't do anything differently. She never had. Jace rode out to California 2 weeks later, and before he left he sat at her kitchen table watching her bag chips in silence until he finally said, "You could have told me about those records 2 years ago. I'd have gotten them in an afternoon." She looked up. "I know. So why didn't you?" She tied off a bag, set it down. "Because I didn't need rescuing," she said. "I needed you to understand what you were looking at." She smiled at him, patient, direct, slightly amused at the world, the same smile she'd always had. "Do you understand now?" He did. Or he was starting to. He rode west with the sun at his back, thinking about the kind of strength that doesn't wear leather. The kind that doesn't need to be seen. The kind that just shows up, and keeps showing up, long after most people would have stopped. He called his mother every Sunday after that. Without fail. Sometimes the heaviest burdens are the ones carried quietly. And sometimes the people carrying them have been holding up more than you ever knew. What's your take on this story? Comment below, I'm reading every one. If this resonated with you, hit the like button and send it to someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this, check out the other videos on the channel. We'll see you there.